Well, welcome back. This is week 2 of our series Into the Bible Verse.
The Bible verse. That's where we get different variants of Bible characters.
That's not what it is.
That's not what it is at all. Moving on already.
That's right. Anyway, week 2 of this. So last week we talked about the Bible is not being a book. It's a collection of manuscripts. It's a library. We talked about the idea that it wasn't written. It was written for us, and it wasn't written to us, which is attributed to Dr. John Walton. And the idea, again, it was written by an ancient culture to an ancient culture, so different language, different sayings that necessarily we wouldn't understand. So what we read are translations. And just all that kind of comes with that. We talked about authorship. We talked about different literary styles within the Bible really briefly. Hope that's a little bit at least helpful and understand when we're coming to the Bible, that we are not looking at something that was, again, written in the modern era, even though we have our translations that sound like it possibly could have.
Yeah.
To help us, again, put a little bit of context and understanding what happens when we read our Bible. And again, we didn't get into a lot of the stuff because, truthfully, there are full-out courses and degrees and master programs that are just kind of on that subject alone, much less just, the entirety of the Bible. And so basically it's just for us that we have at least a passing understanding that'll help us in understanding
and
the Bible.
With that, aren't you glad that there's people who go through that work so that you don't have to?
And make that available.
Yes.
And then are you happy that there are people like us who will read those things that I know some people might be saying, that's not something I want to even read, much less take a course for.
It can be pretty dry.
And I can understand it. Some people just not how they're wired.
Yep. I miss Bible college.
I do too.
When I think about all the research and the reading,
about that.
Nerd. Sorry.
Yes. All right. So the second week, we're going to talk about just looking at essentially when it comes to the Bible, we're going to look at an aerial view. So just kind of like if you see an aerial view of the city you live in, you see basically kind of the idea of the city layout and stuff like that, but you're not looking at just every buildings and just what kind of architecture within the specific buildings and all that. You're really just looking at more the a really simple kind of pulled back, widescreen layout kind of the Bible. And we're looking at, again, what we're called the overarching narrative. We could look at all 66 books that are contained in the Bible. That would take a while. And the Bible Project, which is if you find on YouTube, you can go to their page. They did it really well, and they do it for every single book of the Bible. At first, I don't think we could do it justice, and nowhere as close to as well as they did it. So simple, such great visuals. And we can actually probably just maybe even put a link in the description and show notes of this video, to just their page, and you can go explore that if you've not done already. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Bible Project and other things like that in a later podcast, just the things that can help us understand more. So we're taking this overarching narrative. The Bible does speak a lot to morality and ethics and what it is to be a community, a church, that idea of community. But what we want to focus on is essentially this: the main character, the center of the Bible, and the overarching story, or God's story of the Bible. So let's just jump right in. So, even though you meet many characters in the Bible, the main character from Genesis to Revelation is God.
Which God, Jason?
Whoa. Well, it's the God who's given the name Yahweh. Okay. Quite often he's referred to the God of Jacob.
Yep.
Because I think it's really important that God is a title more so than a name, like Aaron.
Right.
I would say it's the equivalent to like dad, mom. things like that, which are titles more so than names. And so quite often you'll hear it in like Psalms quite often, the God of Jacob. And basically it's like, oh, now we know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yahweh as the name. So it's that the God of that we read about in that scripture, again, the God of Jacob. You understand we're starting with the Israelite people and moving into Christianity and all that sort of stuff. So it's this God woven throughout Genesis and Revelation. In the Old Testament is about God and his interaction and relationship with a nation called Israel. And it's written mostly from that viewpoint of Israel. But it's about God and how he's revealed himself to the nation of Israel. So we see who God is through statements, stories, interactions.
Well, and just something that was always that kind of like blew my mind the first time I heard the ideas is it's also how God we're experiencing God through the eyes of Israel, like how they interpret God, which is it could be scary, but it's also quite fascinating to think that the ancient culture that wrote the texts, we actually are looking through their eyes and experiencing God through their eyes, and even how their interpretation of God progresses through the timeline of the Bible, which I think is a really cool insight for how we even ourselves can read the Bible and thus then interpret God.
Right. I think that it is. I mean, it is seeing, I think it's really important, like, because there are times when they, I guess the best way is to look at it from perspective. Yeah. There are some times where, like, there's God, but, like, we're looking at this perspective, and then somebody looks at that perspective. Yeah. Much like we would look, my kids would probably describe me different than you would describe me. They're describing me as their dad, you would describe me as your friend. Yeah. And I think even though there might be some parallel, and there are that, there's also some different things just because of that. And I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
How amazing is it, though, that we can connect with it still 2,000, 3,000, however many years later?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's really cool. So with the idea that God is the main character, I really think it's important because the mistake I think that we can, make is we could put, and really hear this too much. Yeah. Really stress that emphasis on the people in the Bible. Now, that doesn't mean we're not supposed to look at them, but we could put too much emphasis on that. And what I mean is Tim Mackey would say, we are really not necessarily supposed to emulate the people in the Bible because they are flawed. What he says is we're really supposed to see ourselves in those people. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that we can't learn something, and there's elements that we could go that, but the whole point is really to not emulate these people. And I think one of the maybe really quick understanding of that is David, King David, who's rather prominent in the Old Testament. When we look kind of his story in 1 Samuel, he is chosen by God to be the king of Israel. And there's even some things in there in that time that would say that, he was probably a good choice too. Like it made sense. It's like there's just a lot of great things. So he's chosen, he has great promise. However, he does succumb to abuse of power, selfishness, corruption. We could go on with the list.
Insert self there.
Yeah, well, I think that's just it. Like, the first thing we look at as characters in the Bible are, again, about seeing ourselves, and I would say ourselves directly as even as humanity. We could be chosen, if you whatever you want to use the word, called, we've used, anointed, all that sort of stuff, and have really great promise. That doesn't mean somehow we're like, well, we'll be good at whatever decision we make is going to be great and wonderful. It's like we still have the ability and will and can succumb to sin.
Right.
And I think that's really an important thing. But what does it say about God? I think is once we see that is really a good thing, in that even in the story of David, what it really points to is God is faithful based on his word and his character. I think that's something that we kind of look at. We see that, say, what do we see God doing in this whole thing? We see him being faithful to his promise, keeping up his side of the agreement. We can go back to where we get, like, say, the commandments from, or the 10 commandments and all that sort of stuff. And it was an agreement between the nation of Israel and God. And a lot of the story we see basically Israel not following up on their agreement. Sometimes doing pretty good, but sometimes often not.
Right.
And basically in the midst of Israel, or I'll say this, humanity's flaws, God keeps his side of the agreement, even though Israel, ultimately us, do not. And it's a really good question as we read the Bible. We talk about God being the main character. And I love this. Is something just I learned from Jeff Vanderstelt when it comes to, like, the idea of gospel fluency. Just asking this question: what is this saying about God? Who is he? What is he doing that tells me who he is and even why he's doing it? And the other question, I think, how does Jesus inform us who God is?
Yeah.
We'll get that a little bit. And, just the idea of learning who God is and asking those questions. There are many good questions I think we can ask throughout the Bible, but I think that's just definitely one of them that I think is just really good to be able to, as we're reading, what is this saying about who God is? And definitely the idea is that there are parts of the Bible where that question is easier to answer than others.
Yep.
Because there is times we talked about Exodus 34 where it's saying, loving and compassionate and faithfulness and slow to anger. It's directly said. And there are times where it's maybe very indirect and not so easy to say. And so, I mean, don't feel bad if, like, you read if anyone reads the Bible and, like, who God is, I don't know that what I just read, I got anything for that. That's okay. Sometimes it is harder to see it. I think sometimes, again, we'll talk a little bit more about reading with other people. That sometimes just it's, as we grow or our perspective of life next to someone else's, they sometimes will see that other person can sometimes see something that we've just missed. And there'll be times you'll be like, how did I miss that? And it's really about that, not about, like, beating yourself up. How could I not see that? But being thankful that you are in relationship with someone who could and has shown you how to see it. And now you can't see it a different way.
Yeah, it's that perspective thing again.
It is. Really
Without and community, reading and community, it's important because you need to see, and a community that is not just people who look and think and have experienced what you have. It's you need to have a diversity, and you need to seek out people in your life to be conversation partners, reading partners who can speak something different that you might need to hear, especially for the purpose of challenge and growth.
That's right. Absolutely. It's so important. So, again, we just touched on really briefly there when it comes to, again, the main character being God as we read the Bible, asking that question of ourselves, what is this saying about God, who he is, what he's doing, why he's doing it? And as just the idea is how does, when especially we get into the New Testament and the gospel specifically, how does Jesus inform us of who God is? Because in John 14:9-11, Jesus will say this. He goes, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and yet you still don't know who I am? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. I think that's really an important thing, is that how we're to view Jesus. We look at Jesus to fully understand or come closer to fully understanding who God is. Because he just said in verse 11, just believe that I am in the Father and the Father is me, or at least believe of the work you have seen me to do. And so it is very much the idea of even Jesus saying, when you look at me, you can start to answer that question. Especially, I think, when we have those difficulties of, like, I'm not sure, maybe something in the Old Testament, like, what does it say about God? But using, again, Jesus as that sort of, like, thing to put over top of it and be like, oh, this helps me decipher and understand more of who he is.
Well, and it's interesting. He says, if at least believe because of the work you've seen me do, believe because of the fruit. The fruit that he speaks about this as a tree is known by its fruit. And he speaks that about his followers. They will know you by the love you have for each other. A tree is known for its fruit. And I think that we get so caught up on the wrong kind of things to determine whether or not something is legitimately of God. We're like, do you have the right doctrine? Do you believe the right things? Do you follow the same kind of like conventions that make sense to me as a Christian, rather than like what is coming from a person in their life and how they treat others and how they, all that kind of stuff, to look to see where Jesus is and who Jesus is.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important thing to remember and keep an eye on, and for ourselves. So using John 14, we're going to pivot into the second point. So God is the main character when we're reading the Bible. Just, much as there are lots of great characters that we can learn from and all that sort of stuff, God is the main character. Again, we're looking aerial view.
Sorry, who's the main character?
Sorry,
who's the main character?
That's right.
Francis Chan said it was it's important to note it, like if you were to compare it to a movie, the extras are minor. You pay attention to the main character, what they do. And how they develop, how they grow with you, and that's God. God is the main character. If you miss that, you're missing the whole point.
You're missing the whole point. Right. As good as anything else you could find in there is, and there's good things in there to find.
Oh, definitely.
And there's nothing wrong with valuing a certain character.
Absolutely.
You can value the minor character, but they have such a smaller role than the major character.
It's really God who we're supposed to be seeing.
Well, in a film, the minor character is supposed to make the main character
look good,
make that character's
arc and everything,
develop that, right?
All right, so John 14, we're pivoting that as a good pivot point to what we're going to call the center of the Bible, which is Jesus. Now, this does not mean if you actually have a physical Bible in front of you and you find the exact center, you're going to find Jesus at the exact center.
I think it's like Psalms.
People have done that.
119.
And then they're like, isn't that amazing? And it's like, okay, like they'll do it with the verses. You're like, you do know the verses weren't part of the original. That's probably something we should have said in the first video. The verses are helpful in memory and finding and reference and things like that, finding things. They weren't, the original authors did not put chapter 1 and little like numbers.
Well, I can't wait till I go to heaven and say, hey, John, I really like John 3:16.
Yeah, it's like that. So when people do that, a psalm somewhere, and I'm sure there's lots that you could find something great in there that's really helpful. But the center of the Bible, the point of the Bible, where the Bible's driving to, is ultimately Jesus.
Right.
And really, so again, the idea of not the middle, because really Matthew is about the last third. The very first book of the New Testament, it happens about the last third if you're looking at a physical Bible. And so what do we mean by center? Michael Bird, who's a theologian, writes, Jesus really is the goal of the biblical storyline. The Old Testament points ahead to Jesus as its fulfillment. Michael Bird again would write, the Old Testament is not simply a random bunch of Sunday school tales, morality stories, even though we can find some of that in there. They're not simply that, but a part of a single and unified story, and that Jesus is the climax of God's saving plan. And I love this. He says that every story whispers Jesus. And I think this is really applicable to our discussion, even to the discussion that God is the main character. The idea that every story whispers of Jesus, and it's not necessarily in the same volume or in the same key. I think that's really an important kind of note, if you will, is just that whole idea of Jesus is there. It's woven through all that sort of stuff. God is in there, and it's just a imagine of sometimes it's not necessarily at the same volume.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's not the same key. So sometimes it's not as prevalent as other places, but he's there.
I think that's what I really enjoyed about working at a Church of Christ for a long time, is because they point everything at the end of their sermons. That's the goal, to talk about Jesus in some way, because they do communion every week.
Right.
Let's remember what Jesus did, what he fulfilled. Even if it's something that's so far-fetched, somehow you make that connection and you're like, oh, it's wonderful. It's encouraging.
Well, Charles Spurgeon said, specifically of preaching, or maybe it wasn't, it was said about Charles Spurgeon, but he made a beeline.
Somebody said it.
Beeline.
I think it was about Charles Spurgeon. A beeline for Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
make a beeline for Jesus. You're always heading in that direction.
That's right. It's a really good thing to do. And that's helpful again as we read. Like there is a Jesus direction somewhere in that. It's just a matter of, it may not be, again, plain as day, but we can kind of see that woven throughout the entirety of the Bible. Michael Bird also writes, a central conviction in the Christian understanding of Scripture should be that Jesus fulfills what was promised to Israel about the Messiah in the Old Testament, and Jesus remains the primary subject matter of the New Testament. And I love this. I've been really enjoying Dan White Jr., whether it's on Twitter or his books. He says, Jesus is what the Old Testament was trying to say, but never fully articulated.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. And the New Testament looks back to Jesus as the author, perfecter of our faith. Jesus informs us by teaching through his relationships, interactions, and actions who God is. Again, this is what that John 14 we talked about at the end of the God being the main character. John 14, 8-11 is really talking about. It's going back to that question, what does it say about God? Who is God? And Jesus is kind of giving us a relatable, and dare I say this, even a human understanding of who God is.
What?
The idea that he's giving it in a picture that we can relate to a whole lot more. The extent of his loving compassion lived out through the everyday life of Jesus, his death, and his resurrection.
One of the things we were taught in Sunday school was imagine a skyscraper, and the CEO works at the very top of the building, and that's God. You know, you might not see the CEO a whole lot, but his son also works for the company, and he comes down with the people and works in the lower levels. And I really liked that analogy because you might not be able to see God directly, but when you see Jesus and what he does, you can see.
You see God.
You see God. You see what, if it was an emulation of the two. I'm just like my dad, you know. I really like it.
That's cool. Dan White Jr. also says the glorious truth of God's character is fully articulated in Jesus, who is the true and living Word of God. He goes on to write this. I got a lot of Dan White Jr. quotes. This is the last one, actually. But not only did Jesus come to show us what God looks like, I love this, he also came to show us how to look at people. So when we talk about the center of the Bible, first, absolutely Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, so important. And in that we see Jesus, but also in Jesus we like how to relate to others. And he does it not only in his teachings, but he does it so and it's been recorded so that we can see how he relates to people and sees people. And I think that's such an important thing that he's not only teaches us how to relate to God, then creates a way that we can relate to God through the death on the cross, and the power to relate to God and live a life of following him and being a part of God's family in the kingdom of God. He tells us how we can look and relate to each other.
Well, you kind of touched on the gospel fluency. What is God doing? And then now, who am I because of it? And what am I going to do about it? How am I going to live in light of this?
Yeah.
And I like those questions. They help me when I read.
Absolutely. I find them really helpful too. So just to ending off this sort of little part of the other, Jesus in the center. We talked a little about the Old Testament. Jesus, the fulfillment of all the promises God gave to Israel, and then it's walking in that direction. The New Testament and the writers of the early church leaders are guiding the early church in these things by looking back to Jesus. And then we have the Gospels that sort of sit in the idea of this is who he was, and this is the life and his life, his death, his resurrection, and then again, just that they all kept looking back to Jesus as where we're supposed to be, not only as an example, which he was, but also as empowerment of moving forward. And the last sort of thing of this, the idea again, we have God is the main character, Jesus is the center of the Bible, and the idea of this overarching God story. We've talked about this actually as a church quite a bit over the years. We actually just finished a series Started middle of April, end of June. So we'll really briefly go over this. We won't spend a lot of time. We'll just, people, if you want to, anyone listening, watching, wants to sort of more dive deeper into this, you can go back to that series. We're going to just basically talk about the basic story arc. First, there's creation. God's intention. Made in his image. Humanity's in a great relationship with God, with each other. There's purpose and their identity.
Yep.
Fall, it's because of sin. Relational death with God, with each other. I think it's really important to note that in there as well. Looking for another source for identity, purpose, and truth. Redemption in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I should be along with that. Creation, we talked about that. Fall, redemption. This is the third part of the arc. In the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, relationship of God is restored through the life and power that comes from Jesus. And we learn how to be in relationship with God and with others. And then restoration, the power of actually living that out. I think that's really important the power of living it out, restore relationship with God, with each other, and it's really important, in the here and now. Yes, absolutely. That includes the idea of heaven and new earth and all that. Absolutely 100% that includes that, but it's also about the here and now. That we can enjoy an idea. I've heard often like a shadow of, the heaven and earth right here and now, that we are to seek first the kingdom of God. And I think there's so much, the idea of the here and now is, Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount Jesus gives that, like that's not, yes, I believe that's for new earth as well, but that's for the right here and now as well. So again, there's a series about that. We don't really want to go further.
We sort of did do a series on that when we did What If Jesus Was Serious?
Yeah, we did that on the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, I forgot we did that too. What do you think of that? I was more thinking about the story of God arc. Again, that's creation, fall, redemption, restoration.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the aerial view. We hope that's a little bit helpful. Again, what that is when we're reading the Bible, we're looking for the main character woven throughout, and that is God. We're looking at the center of the Bible, which is Jesus. Everything's either looking forward to that or looking back to that, and informing kind of basically the idea of the Bible centers on who Jesus was and what he did and what he's doing even today. And then God's story, which again is creation, fall, redemption, restoration, seeing that woven throughout the entirety of when we read.
My prof said in university, and he looked right at me and said, "The greatest love story is not you and Nikki, Kyle. It's about how far God went to win your heart." And that's the Bible.
Yeah.
A love story.
Yeah. So that's week 2. We hope that this is somewhat helpful. I'll always feel free to comment questions. Again, if on this one, we really sped through God's story. Go back to I believe it's called The Story of God for Dummies is the series. And that would have been, we had ended at the end of June, to get a little more insight of what that is and what that looks like. And and then the next time actually that we have our discussion on this into the Bible verse will be in person.
August 21st. So in person, and we'll kind of take the next sort of section of that. And so hopefully we will actually see you there, anyone who's watching or listening. And that's a wrap.